Justine reached out to me to cover a session today, and just because of all the news at the moment, I thought El Nino and the current weather extremes that are all in the news at the moment. It seemed quite a relevant session to cover and to do a bit of a deep dive into. So again, linking back to all the different sustainability behaviours that we're promoting through these webinars, I've said that this webinar sort of crosses all of them, including across our environmental strategy as well, just because if we think about the impact of this and how we can try and reduce the impact, it touches on all of these areas. Just this is the sort of the headlines that we're seeing at the moment. Maybe people on this call, or maybe people on this call know somebody who's maybe had a holiday abroad cancelled recently. The wildfires in Greece, in Portugal. This is all going to be sort of covered in this session today. One of these headlines here, around 4/5 of humanity hit by the heat linked to climate change in July, was quite an impactful headline for me. This is quite a gloomy selection of headlines as well. So let's do a bit of a deep dive. So in summary, if we're looking at sort of what this is all about, it can be put down into one or two sentences. That at the moment the planet is being hit by this double whammy of global heating. So that's the global temperature rise caused by greenhouse gas emissions, as well as this emerging El Nino as well. So maybe you've heard of this term, maybe you haven't. It's a climate pattern that describes the unusual warming of surface waters in the Pacific Ocean. And this happens, it's a natural phenomenon, and it happens every 2 to 7 years. And this latest period started in June and will continue until bringing us into sort of Christmas and spring of 24. The last major El Nino event was 2014, 2016, and in 2016 we had, is the current record for the hottest year on record. And every El Nino cycle brings these increased heat waves, droughts, wildfires and floods, these extreme weather patterns. And this powerful weather event actually also has the potential to increase global temperatures as well. So this is hopefully going to work. The video that I have in, thought this was best to sort of describe this weather pattern with a graphic rather than sort of me talk through a series of pictures. Okay, it's not going to work. So I've already got it linked up, hopefully, and hopefully the sound works. If it doesn't, the captions at the bottom, you'll be able to follow along, sort of when we talk about El Nino, what exactly do we mean?
Every few years, the El Nino phenomenon kicks into life in the Pacific Ocean around the equator. It can affect weather around the world, changing the odds of floods, drought, heat waves, and cold seasons for different regions. What is El Nino, and how does it happen? Firstly, we need to know what's normally happening in the tropical Pacific. This vast stretch of ocean sees consistent winds, called trade winds, that blow from east to west. These winds push warm water near the surface in their direction of travel, so the warm water piles up on the western side of the ocean around Asia and Australasia. On the other side of the ocean, around South and Central America, as the warm water gets pushed away from the coast, it's replaced by cold water, which is pulled up from deeper down in the ocean, a process called upwelling. This creates a temperature difference across the tropical Pacific, with warmer water piled up in the west and cooler water in the east. Warmer water adds extra heat to the air, which causes the air to rise with more vigor, and it's this rising air that creates an area of more unsettled weather, with more cloud and rainfall. That rising air in the west sets up atmospheric circulation across this part of the world, with warm, moist air rising on one side of the ocean and cooler, drier air descending on the other. This circulation reinforces the easterly winds, so this part of the world sits in a self-perpetuating state until El Niño begins. If conditions are right, tropical Pacific weather systems or slow changes in the ocean around the equator can set off a chain of events which weaken or even reverse the usual trade winds. With weakened trade winds, there's less push of warm surface water to the western side of the ocean and less upwelling of cold water on the eastern side. This allows the usually colder parts of the ocean to warm, cancelling out the normal temperature difference. Because the area of warmest water moves, so does the associated wet and unsettled weather. This changes rainfall patterns over the equatorial Pacific, as well as the large-scale wind patterns. It's this change in winds which has a knock-on effect, changing temperature and rainfall in locations around the world. The main impacts are around the tropics, where you see an increase in the risk of floods in Peru and droughts in Indonesia, India, and parts of Brazil. But virtually wherever you are in the world, El Niño has the potential to affect you directly via the weather or indirectly via socio-economic impacts. There's another impact from El Niño which happens because of all the extra heat at the surface of the tropical Pacific.
I'm just going to leave the video there just because it goes into quite a lot of detail, but hopefully that gives you an understanding of exactly what El Nino is. And as was mentioned briefly in the video just now to talk about some of the impacts. So El Nino is that warming of the Pacific Ocean, and you can see that on this map here across the Pacific Ocean. But also you can see there's sort of this global temperature effect where we've got increasing of oceans across the globe. And warming oceans are a concern for many reasons. Seawater takes up more space when it's at higher temperature, so we've got accelerating sea level rise. Warmer water at the poles accelerates the melting of the ice caps as well. And then also these hotter temperatures can be detrimental to marine ecosystems as well, and in particular corals as well. And that's where we often see this coral bleaching. Scientists fear that this rapid warming that you can see in that map could be a sign the climate crisis is progressing at a faster rate than was maybe first predicted. As was mentioned in the video as well, so these weather patterns and the wind over the oceans drives the weather that we experience on land. So places closest to the Pacific are most strongly affected by El Nino. So there's often heavy rains, flooding in Peru, Ecuador, and also heat and drought maybe in Colombia, Central America. As well, I've put this map up here, which was from the previous El Nino, so from 2014 to 2016, and it shows the impact of forest fires in Indonesia. In Indonesia, there's a lot of tropical peat. So when there's obviously burning, we've got release of carbon, but also the burning of the peatland really intensified the amount of carbon that was released, and Indonesia declared a state of emergency with this sort of plume of smoke and carbon monoxide that you can see that's travelled for thousands of miles sort of across the globe. This graph here shows sort of the annual surface temperatures. So those are the grey bars, and they're grouped by decade. So the two main things to look at from this graph is that you can see from the 1950s to where we are now, the overall temperature has increased every year, these years are warmer and warmer, and the warmest years of those decades are marked with a red dot, and that's those El Nino years. So that's why this is, when we talk about this double whammy effect, it's the rising global temperatures that are boosted by El Nino, and that's what is bringing on these extreme weather patterns that we are experiencing. And the link between climate change and weather and oceans, it's really complex. I'm no meteorologist, but yeah, this is a clear graph here showing that global rise in temperatures is boosted by El Nino. So yeah, just relating back to the news that we're seeing at the moment, these climate records just this year that have been broken so far. So we experienced the hottest day on record. We also had the hottest June on record from a pre-industrial period. The temperature was 1.57 degrees above the pre-industrial period. And when we talk about carbon targets, me and Sophie will often mention how our carbon targets are science-based, and that's because they're aligned with the Paris Agreement, where we're looking at keeping global warming below 1.5. So you can see that we are really close to that 1.5 above pre-industrial temperatures, and that's why it's so important that we're working towards the carbon management plan. We've had the most extreme marine heat waves, as well as a record low Arctic sea ice levels as well. So talking about all of this, I thought I'd link this back to what this actually means to ground control, and thinking about us as a whole business and how these new weather conditions might affect our operations and our services that we provide. I've just got a few examples here, but maybe as I talk through these, you might consider how your job and your department of ground control would be affected by these new weather conditions. So something that we will need to think about moving into the future is heat exhaustion. So how is this going to impact our work arrangements? How can we better support operatives during heat waves, and making sure that they are safe when they're out on site? The average number of days of frost every year is decreasing. So maybe we need to consider our gritting and our snow clearance business. Actually, how is that going to be affected by this global rise in temperature? Storms. So there's a picture here of a tree on a train track, but potentially, we've got more vegetation that's going to potentially fall over in the storms. Potentially for ground control, a benefit might be that actually we have an increased number of emergency call-outs, and maybe we will see an increase in business operations in this area in the future. Plant stress. So increasing temperatures will make disease more abundant, more severe. Droughts, wildfires are going to put lots of stress on plants as well. Limited water availability in droughts as well, is that's going to reduce growth, put more stress on the plants, potentially as well pests. And all of this, potentially we're going to have plants that are more vulnerable, and we need to think looking forward 10, 30 years at ground control. What plants do we plant? When do we plant them? Our watering regime, what species we do select, what's the most appropriate to withstand these stresses that we're predicting in the next 10, 30 years. The plant growing season is actually now a month longer than it was in 1990. Oh, I've lost my light. So we've actually got an increased growing season. So actually we might have an increased demand in our cutting. GM are very busy this time at the moment. Potentially GM are going to be even busier in the next 10, 30 years. There's an opportunity also to grow our business around nature-based solutions, and the work that we're doing at the moment through the farms that we've purchased, and how can we plan and manage landscapes much more efficiently for the future. That's all, we're researching that and sharing that knowledge with our clients as well. And the last one there is just potentially floods. This could limit ground control. It might affect the growing conditions. Floods might restrict our access onto sites, affect our work arrangements, but also potentially floods could be a new business opportunity, potentially sort of the cleanup. Maybe that's something that ground control could start doing. Um, yeah, so this is just an example of a few. But yeah, as I was going through those, maybe thinking in procurement, how is our supply chain going to be affected in the next 10, 30 years in IT? Data centers, everything is online now. How do we keep these data centers cool? How do we keep powering them? That's something that yeah, is going to be sort of difficult to manage potentially in the next few years. And what we're now thinking about, what ground control will now do, is the need to adapt our operations, do sort of a level of risk management for these years to come with these new environmental conditions. And what we potentially can do as well is build in sort of a financial risk as well. So put a cost to some of these. For example, if we plant X number of trees and all of those trees die due to severe droughts, wildfires, what's the financial implication for us? And that's sort of how we can sort of build up this picture of how the environmental conditions will affect ground control in the future. I've linked this map at the end, but it's an interactive map, and you can go in there and you can just sort of see the true impact, and it's mapped of the different extreme weather conditions that actually can be linked back to climate change. I won't go into too much here, but I found an interesting resource that you may want to read up on as well. So if all of this warming, we know this is coming, and the difficulty that we do have now looking to the future is there is a lag in the effects from the emissions that have already been released. So at whatever point so for ground control, we're looking at net zero for 2038. At whatever point we manage to halt or reverse that increase, that release in greenhouse gas emissions, there will be some additional warming that will occur after that date due to the imbalance there is at the moment in the atmosphere. So that's when it comes into this risk management and this business planning. What can we do in the future to sort of build up our resilience and adapt to these changes? So in the context of climate change, adaptation can be defined as the process to adjust to the actual or expected climate and its effects. So there's an opportunity to take advantage of some of these new conditions, like I said, with this potential new business opportunities, but also it's an opportunity to plan and think ahead for some of the negative impacts as well. And businesses, societies, individuals are all doing this at the moment. And I've got a few examples just on the next slide. So the first picture is in Melbourne, Australia. And they're really focusing on how they manage floods. So they've increased the amount of stormwater, so the amount of water they can harvest, and then they're actually building structures that will then increase the harvesting and then feed that water back to green spaces. And actually, this is then a bit of a butterfly effect, because when you're then watering parks, street trees, increasing biodiversity, there's also the impact for those trees to also absorb some of the stormwater as well. So that's an example that's going on in Melbourne. In Tanzania, they built a seawall, so that prevents some of the beach erosion from the waves, but also allows the beach to recover after a storm. And then also that space is being used as a recreational area, and there's lots of small businesses in that area as well. In Mexico City, they're really concerned about the quantity and quality of water supply in the future. So the city has set a goal of installing 10,000 household rainwater harvesting systems every year. And again, that's managing for this risks and this outcomes that we're expecting in our new environmental climate. I was speaking to Amanda earlier in the office, and I'm not sure if she managed to join the call or not, but talking about the impacts of this on farmers. Just in the UK, we've got UK farmers now growing kiwis, peaches, nectarines, grapes. English wine is really taking off as well. So that's something that we're expecting. We've had these warmer weathers, and we're expecting this to continue. It may potentially impact the agricultural map that we have globally of what we can plant, where and when across the planet. So then bringing this back to what you can do as an individual when it comes to adapting your behaviours and thinking ahead for these new environmental conditions, this warmer world that we're expecting. So there's definitely opportunities for all of us to change different behaviours, and yeah, small changes, they do really all add up. So yeah, and then I think I've just got the final slide just to wrap up. So in conclusion, what is happening to our weather system? Our weather system is being hit by this double whammy of global heating. Why is this happening? So we've talked about El Niño, this natural weather phenomenon, and it's how that impact is increased by this human-induced global warming. Thinking ahead, how is this going to impact humans and ground control as our business? There are lots of negative. There's also some potential benefits that we can capitalize on. And what do we do to adapt to the future? And that's really sort of planning now and thinking ahead to the future of how can we adapt the way that we are as businesses, individuals, communities. Yeah, it's an opportunity now to sort of plan and manage risk. So that's just some resources, just things that I've mentioned so far. But yeah, be interesting to hear any thoughts, any questions from the audience. As I said, I'm no meteorologist, but I will do my best to answer any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Olivia. I can see a comment from Sophie in the chat just asking if we can drop the YouTube video in there. That would be handy if we could do that.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments that people want to ask before we wrap up? That was really interesting and really insightful. Anything else? Stunned